Ripple just took an equity stake in Flutterwave, Africa's biggest payments company, valued at $3.2 billion. RLUSD, the XRP Ledger, and Ripple payments are getting wired directly into rails that already move over $50 billion across 35 African countries. This isn't a pilot, it's production. Here's exactly what's documented and what's still just framing. This isn't financial advice, just educational content. Do your own research before making financial decisions. If this kind of breakdown is useful, hit like. It helps the channel reach more people. Let's start with the actual deal, because the details are specific and worth getting right rather than approximated. On June 16th, 2026, Ripple announced a strategic investment in Flutterwave as part of the company's Series E funding round. The round values Flutterwave at $3.2 billion, with Bloomberg citing a figure as high as $3.3 billion based on CEO commentary. Neither side has disclosed the size of Ripple's investment or what percentage of equity it received. Flutterwave itself isn't a startup testing an idea. It's already processed over 1 billion transactions worth more than $50 billion across 35 African countries, and it's raised over $500 million across its funding history. The partnership rests on three specific pillars. First, RLUSD, Ripple's dollar-backed stablecoin, gets embedded into Flutterwave's payment rails and its Send app remittance product as a primary settlement asset for high-volume corridors. Second, the XRP Ledger gets used for transaction clearing, the actual settlement layer underneath the stablecoin movement. Third, a unified API connects Flutterwave's existing domestic network to Ripple Payments, Ripple's global payments infrastructure, so the two systems talk to each other directly rather than through a separate integration layer. Reese Merrick, Ripple's managing director for the Middle East and Africa, described the logic plainly. Flutterwave already built one of the most advanced payments networks on the continent, and as that infrastructure evolves, stablecoins are becoming central to it. Flutterwave's CEO, Olugbenga Agboola, framed it from the other side, saying the investment lets the company scale its infrastructure and accelerate a stablecoin roadmap it had already been building toward. This is the part worth being precise about, because the deal didn't appear out of nowhere. Flutterwave had already partnered with Polygon Labs back in October 2025 to launch stablecoin payments for businesses and had acquired a startup called Mono to unify fragmented banking rails. Both moves were already pointing toward a stablecoin-first architecture before Ripple ever entered the picture. The Ripple investment is the more institutional phase of a strategy Flutterwave was already executing, not the beginning of one. Now, here's why this corridor specifically matters, separate from who's involved. Cross-border payments in Africa are widely cited as the most expensive in the world, often running around 8% in fees with multi-day settlement times, largely because so many transactions route through European correspondent banks rather than direct rails. That's the actual problem being solved here, not a theoretical inefficiency, but a documented, expensive bottleneck that businesses and remittance senders deal with constantly. RLUSD settling directly in dollar-pegged value over the XRP Ledger removes a chain of intermediary banks from that process. The Send app, Flutterwave's remittance product specifically targeting diaspora money transfers, becomes the first place this gets tested at meaningful volume. Once you separate this is a settlement layer XRP earns fees on from this is a direct XRP price catalyst, you stop waiting for the chart to react to news that was never built to move it that way in the first place. The XRP Ledger's role here is structural, not promotional. Transactions clear on it, and small fees get paid in XRP for that clearing. That's a real recurring use case. but it's a usage story, not a speculative catalyst story, and conflating the two leads to disappointment when the price doesn't immediately spike on the announcement. Let's place this inside the broader pattern of Ripple's African expansion, because Flutterwave isn't the first move here, it's the latest in a sequence that's been building for over a year. MFS Africa uses Ripple payments to power cross-border payments between Africa and the GCC, UK, and Australia, enabling remittances into 27 African countries. Chipper Cash partnered with Ripple for cheaper, faster cross-border transfers, serving roughly 5 million customers across 9 African countries. Absa Bank in South Africa, one of the continent's leading banks, became Ripple's first major digital asset custody partner in Africa. Each of these is a separate, real partnership, and together they describe a company deliberately building out corridor by corridor rather than making one big announcement and hoping it scales on its own. Now, let me bring in the treasury side of this story because it's a separate but related piece of what Ripple's actually building, and it deserves its own accurate accounting. In October 2025, Ripple acquired G Treasury, a corporate treasury software company, for $1 billion. G Treasury had processed roughly $13 trillion in payment volume the prior year for clients ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies, none of that volume on Stablecoins or XRP. Ripple relaunched the platform as Ripple Treasury in January 2026, and on April 1st, 2026, it added 2 specific new capabilities: digital asset accounts and unified treasury. These let corporate finance teams hold, view, and manage XRP and RLUSD balances directly alongside their traditional fiat accounts, inside the same dashboard they already use for cash, debt, and short-term investments, without needing a separate crypto wallet or third-party custodian. Ripple's own 2026 survey of more than 1,000 global finance leaders found that 72% said they need digital asset capabilities to stay competitive, but most lacked a way to actually integrate those tools into their existing workflows. That's the specific gap Ripple Treasury is built to close. Brad Garlinghouse summarized the logic directly. Give corporates a trusted, regulated entry point embedded in workflows they already use. And that's now solved. Garlinghouse has separately projected that roughly 30% of that $13 trillion in annual G Treasury linked volume could move onto blockchain rails over the next 5 years. That's his stated estimate, not a confirmed outcome. And it's worth treating it as exactly that, a CEO's forward-looking target for a platform that only added native digital asset functionality this April. Whether corporate treasurers actually move meaningful volume onto these rails will depend on how quickly Ripple delivers the next stage of capabilities it's promised, including cross-border intercompany settlement and 24/7 yield on idle cash through overnight repo markets, and whether CFOs treat the tool as more than a read-only dashboard. Here's a piece worth correcting directly because it gets misunderstood constantly in this space. When people see a new stablecoin or a new partner getting added to the XRP Ledger, a common reaction is disappointment, the assumption being that every new asset on the ledger somehow competes with or dilutes XRP's relevance. That was never the design intent. The XRP Ledger was built from the start to support multiple currencies and assets, not just XRP itself. The same way a road network is built to carry many different vehicles rather than just one. The actual mechanism that matters here is auto bridging. When 2 different assets on the ledger need to be exchanged and there isn't a deep direct trading pair between them, XRP can serve as the intermediate hop that completes the swap efficiently. More currencies and assets added to the ledger means more potential pairs where that bridging function gets triggered, not fewer. The right question when a new asset gets added isn't why not XRP? It's does this create more situations where XRP gets used as the bridge? That's also the structural logic behind why RLUSD, growing on Flutterwave's rails, strengthens rather than competes with XRP's role. The actual transaction volume in this Africa deal will likely settle primarily in RLUSD, since that's the stable dollar pegged asset businesses want for pricing predictability. But the XRP ledger is what clears those transactions, and where RLUSD needs to convert against other currencies or assets without a deep direct pool, XRP's bridging function is what gets called on. More RLUSD volume moving through African corridors is more clearing activity and more potential bridging activity on the ledger, even if XRP itself isn't the asset end users see in their app. Now, let me address the wallet infrastructure argument because it connects this Africa deal to a much larger thesis about where asset management is heading generally. And it's worth hearing from the person who's actually spent years building toward it. Sandy Call, head of innovation at Franklin Templeton, has described a vision where someone's entire financial life, checking accounts, savings, brokerage, healthcare accounts, insurance, all consolidates into a single wallet interface. Her argument is that once those assets live in one place, they become genuinely interoperable. You can see your total wealth picture, evaluate whether a given holding should be lent out, staked, or moved into a liquidity pool, all from one interface instead of manually reconciling a dozen disconnected accounts. Franklin Templeton has been building on the XRP Ledger with Ripple since before the SEC lawsuit even started, back into 2018 and 2019, which means this wasn't a relationship that formed because of recent regulatory clarity. It predates it by years. Call connects this directly to the broader tokenization push from the DTCC, NYSE, and NASDAQ this year, even in what she calls a digital twin model, where a tokenized stock or bond is a digital representation rather than a fully native digital instrument. She argues it will force every institution dealing professionally with equities and bonds to build out wallet infrastructure simply because the tokenized version requires it. That's a real structural argument independent of any single asset's price, and it's the same wallet-centric infrastructure thesis that connects directly to why Ripple's treasury and payments products are being built the way they are. So here's the honest synthesis of where this all actually stands. The Flutterwave investment is real, documented across multiple independent sources, and already embedding RLUSD, Ripple payments, and the XRP Ledger into production infrastructure processing over $50 billion annually across 35 African countries. It joins a pattern of prior African partnerships, MFS Africa, Chipper Cash, Absa Bank, that together describe deliberate corridor-by-corridor expansion rather than a single isolated announcement. Ripple Treasury's $13 trillion in annual volume through the former G Treasury platform is real and documented, and its native XRP and RLUSD integration launched this April is a genuine first for the treasury management industry, though Garlinghouse's 30% in 5 years figure is a stated projection, not a confirmed outcome. The auto-bridging mechanism is real architecture, and it means new stablecoins and assets joining the ledger generally strengthen rather than dilute XRP's structural role, even when the visible settlement asset in any given transaction is something other than XRP itself. And the broader wallet infrastructure thesis from Franklin Templeton's Sandy Call connects to a multi-year relationship with Ripple that predates the current regulatory environment entirely. None of this requires the price to move today to be meaningful. It requires the infrastructure to keep getting built and used, which is a slower and less exciting story than a price prediction, but it's the one that's actually documented. Which piece of this do you think matters most for XRP's longer term utility case? The Flutterwave deal specifically, the Ripple Treasury integration, or the auto bridging mechanism itself? Drop your take in the comments. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually documented here, go ahead and like it and subscribe for the next one. Share it with someone who saw the Flutterwave headline and is still confused about whether it's an XRP story or an RLUSD story. The Flutterwave deal is real, it's in production, and it's one piece of a much bigger pattern Ripple's been building for years. None of that requires the price to move today to matter. It just requires the infrastructure to keep getting used. Stay informed, stay positioned. I'll see you in the next one.